This is WZRD Chicago 88.3 FM. And we have with us at WZRD via Zoom, Catherine Carr.
Hello.
Hello. She is the author of the new book, Breaking Your Bonds. Hello, Catherine. How are you today?
I'm doing well, thank you. How are you?
Very, very well. We're very excited to talk about your book, Breaking Your Bonds, and it's a very unusual book. It's kind of encroaching on taboo topics, but but it is very interesting. Could you tell us a little bit about uh, the trickster?
Yes, the tricksters. So those of you who know me know that I am a devotee of the particular trickster god Loki. And tricksters are, I think, so important because they play this kind of balancing role in the spiritual ecosystem. They are the ones who, when one party is very strong, they can find ways to empower the weaker parties to advocate for themselves. And it's interesting because if you look at mythology, very often there are stories of tricksters kind of overthrowing older orders that maybe aren't working so well anymore and allowing for the establishment of new orders. So there are a lot of examples of that in mythology.
Well, establishment of orders. Once you're talking about an order, you're talking about a hierarchy. And a lot of times the hierarchies are controlling. And of course, in your book, it's about breaking your bonds of that or who would control you. Is there in any way that the hierarchy or of the trickster might control you?
You know, my experience with tricksters and the people who follow tricksters is that they really don't like control. I always tell people, if you're following someone who is really controlled or really concerned about controlling people and looking good for the cameras, that's probably a red flag because the essence of life sort of is to be unpredictable and to be responsive. And there are times and places where hierarchy is needed or useful, but once you've got a hierarchy established, they don't tend to like to end themselves. So that's where the trickster comes in, when there's a time for new growth. And I've seen people who claim to be, for example, devotees of trickster gods get very controlling, and I'm like, that's a red flag for me in any religious environment. When someone wants to, for example, control your private life, that's a huge red flag. And that goes for people who claim to be doing trickster work just as much as for people who are all about law and order and hierarchy. So
And so you mentioned that hierarchies are, did you say that they are unpredictable and but responsive, right? But then they should also be responsible, correct?
yes, and that's the problem that tends to happen is once you have a power structure, it's very easy for the people at the top to stop being responsive to the needs of the people and the environment and start just controlling things for their own benefit. So that's kind of when you need a trickster who's going to come in and disrupt the hierarchy and find ways to do things that are outside of the currently established rules.
Okay, now let's bring together what you mean in your title of Breaking Your Bonds and the Trickster.
Yes. Yes, so the I talked a lot about tricksters in the Breaking of Bonds book because they are, in my opinion, very helpful to this work. What the Breaking of Bonds refers to is I think we all find ourselves in situations at times where we feel bound to something that we don't want to be bound to anymore. Maybe it's an idea or an emotion or a relationship or an addiction. And this is actually my ritual that's contained in the Breaking Your Bonds book is actually something that's been used in prison ministries to, to help people with the things that they feel like they can't get away from. And the work of breaking your bonds, I find tricksters very helpful too, because they are, entities that don't think that that the unwilling restraint is necessarily a good thing. So whenever there are bonds of maybe feelings of obligation or pressure or rules that have become unhealthy, they're very helpful for that.
Mhm. And uh, in what situations would the trickster step in, and in what light, in what character would you see the trickster?
There is, tricksters are often characterized by this predisposition for mischief, which people who are very controlling and really like rules see as a very bad thing. They're like, oh, how dare this person do this thing? That's malicious. But what it really does is when people are, playing pranks and breaking rules, it introduces the potential for change. It introduces the potential for new things to be discovered and new things to grow. And it's interesting because, like, in the Norse myths, if you look, Loki messes up kind of a lot of things, but just about every time he does, the result is actually better than what the original plan was. It's very often a like, Loki, you messed up your plans, now what are we going to do? And what ends up happening instead is better than the original plan. And I think that really speaks to the nature of tricksters. There are other examples from mythology, like in Sumerian mythology, Inanna, she's not usually thought of as a trickster. She's thought of as more of a traditional monarch. But her plot arc with humanity starts out with her actually tricking these Sumerian gods into giving her these skills of civilization, and then she gives those to humans. And there's a surprising number of mythologies around the world where the start of human civilization is actually one of the gods taking something they weren't supposed to from the other gods and giving it to humans. So I think that's a really good example of how, being tricky and breaking the rules is not always a bad thing, at least as far as us humans are concerned.
What about the Pandora and her box? Does that connect with the trickster myth? Well, the trickster mindset almost.
I'm less familiar with the Greco-Roman myths than with some other myths, so I don't know if there might be some trickster element to that, but I do know that, and this is another example of why we don't always love hierarchies. To my understanding, it is actually Zeus, like the king lawgiver god, that is kind of
Mhm.
responsible for the Pandora situation. So that's, another example of why in balanced pantheons, maybe we don't always assume that the guy who's in charge and making the rules is perfect.
Mhm. And Loki is masculine. Are there any tricksters that are feminine?
So that's a really great point you make, actually, because I refer to Loki using he, him pronouns, but Loki in the myths, the original myths from like thousands of years ago, is actually gender fluid. So there are people who refer to Loki as she. We do know that Loki has given birth on multiple occasions and is the mother of multiple characters. Um, Probably also doing some gender non-binary stuff since they like to go back and forth. But so I feel like that's important to note because Loki is a really powerful representation of gender changing and the role that that can play in spirituality. Inanna, who I mentioned earlier, she's not mostly known as a trickster deity, but she was the queen of heaven. She was actually the head of the Sumerian pantheon for much of the history of, the oldest Western civilization. Sumer is. She was in charge of the pantheon, and she is such an interesting example to study because she is both, unquestionably in charge and kind of traditionally feminine. She's never shown having children really, but there are some I should warn you, some of her hymns are very explicit. she was she was very proud of her femininity, including her sexuality. So if you ever want some real racy hymns, that's the Sumerians are good to go to.
And that's very ancient. That was like those are even older than the Greek myths, right? The Greek civilization,
Yes,
quite
yes.
quite much.
The Sumerian myths actually the first,
Mhm,
I believe, the oldest piece of literature for which we have the name of the author recorded
mhm,
is actually a hymn to Inanna by one of her priestesses.
mhm. You spoke of Loki with the knife to help you break a bond.
Yeah.
Does Anana ever have something like that that's comparable to what Loki represented to you?
So this is a good time to talk about the reason I came to the breaking of bonds kind of imagery and wording is that there is a point in the Norse mythos where Loki is bound. He is tied up and tortured essentially by the other gods. And the question of why that happens is interesting because we don't know exactly what chronological order to place the myths in, so we don't know what was the last thing he did to cause them to decide to do that. But when he breaks free, that does trigger Ragnarok, which is popularly portrayed as this terrible thing where it's this big war and everyone dies, but it also leads to the creation of a new world that is being overseen by a god. It's not Loki or Odin, but by a god who is very beloved in the Norse mythos. So there are many who have interpreted that to mean that, it destroys the old order, but it gives rise to this new, better order. And that is in keeping with the previous instances in the myths where, Loki messes up what you had planned, but you end up with something better. So I got to the breaking of bonds imagery from the imagery of him literally breaking his bonds to get out and start Ragnarok. And this is something you hear a lot in more pagan mythological circles where the death card, the Ragnarok event can actually be a very good thing because it's the opportunity for new creation. For Inanna, she again is more of a traditional authority figure than a traditional trickster, but she does have a very interesting, another piece of imagery that's very popular is Inanna's journey to the underworld, where she goes to the underworld and gradually gives up her power. And then she has to find her way back out to reclaim her power as Queen of Heaven. And there's a whole very rich mythos around that. It's less of a trickster oriented thing, but it is a very good empowerment mythos to work with because it is all about, reclaiming your power and really your ultimate power because she's the queen, right?
And how did you come to connect with Loki? Is it more of a representation of breaking your bonds with authority and control, or do you actually see him?
So I do speak to Loki like a lot of religious people, I do hear my gods talk to me. And Loki is a very interesting one because I think he really appeals to people, or she or they,
Mhm,
really appeal to people who have had bad experiences with religious authorities
mhm,
because he's so anti-authoritarian. So people who are like, I have this spiritual side, I'm having spiritual experiences, and I want more, spiritual meaning in my life, but they're like, excuse me, I can't with the lawgiver gods. I can't with the gods who are going to tell me, just follow my rules and it'll be fine. Trust
mhm.
me. Loki is like the opposite of that. And sometimes he's characterized as being a little bit rough because sometimes if he teaches lessons, he's not going to tell you what the lesson is. He's going to put you in a situation where you have no choice but to learn the lesson, which I find very effective and actually very refreshing because I do have trust issues with the like trust me bro model of religious laws, but I
Mhm.
have learned a lot from Loki and pardon me, gracious. And the breaking of bonds work came about after I'd been working with him for a number of years, and gracious.
That's okay.
Okay.
Take care of yourself. Do you need a
No
drink of
problem.
water, maybe?
Yeah, let me give that a try. But the breaking of bonds work came about when I had been working with him for a number of years, and it became clear that I really needed a full transformation in my life, which I talk about a little. I was in a place where my plans for my life were not going the way I had hoped they would, and I had internalized this idea that I couldn't make radical changes because that would be too disruptive to other people around me. But it reached a point where I was like, this is not sustainable for anyone involved, really. And this is the work that came out of that.
You spoke of yourself as a problem solver for everybody around you, and you figured that maybe that wasn't such a good idea for some of the people. How did you manage to become a problem solver for yourself? Did you have to connect with Loki first, or what is the little timeline of what came first?
Yeah.
Did you try solving something for yourself first, or did Loki come up on the scene and then help you with solving your own problems?
So this is a great topic because there is a timeline, and it gives me an opportunity to talk about therapy as well. Because I do
Hmm.
believe that working with my therapist that I had at the time was also necessary for this work. I was, kind of raised with this idea from my church that it was my job to solve any problems that came up around me, whether they were mine or not. And at first, I think there was something admirable about that. But as I got older, what was happening was that I was attracting more and more people who couldn't solve their own problems. And they weren't learning to solve their own problems because they didn't have to, because I would take care of it. And that's what I realized was unsustainable. I had realized I had this kind of rock bottom moment where, long story short, a lot of things fell apart because I wasn't there. And they were all things that had wanted me at the same time. And that's when I realized this can't continue for anyone's sake. And I did start going to therapy for the first time after that. I had not been going to therapy before because I had been like, I'm usually in less distress than most of the people around me. But at that point, I came to a point of maybe there's a reason that I keep ending up in these situations where everyone around me is distressed. So I worked with a really brilliant therapist who I was able to get my publishing career going. I had a lot of unpublished manuscripts at that time. He helped convince me to start submitting them, and some really great things came out of that. I had been working with Loki before I worked with my therapist, and I do think that he helped me get to a place where I realized that I needed therapy because I had been working with him for a number of years, and he had been very clear for a number of years that he did not love how a lot of people were treating me, and he didn't feel like I was really following my passions and my purpose in life. So he was very helpful in getting me to that point, but I think I also can't overemphasize the importance of therapy because that was something where for years and years I went, oh, I don't need therapy. I'm fine. And then now I wish I had done it earlier, to be honest. I wish I'd done it a few years earlier.
Well, I guess it seems as if you burned yourself out. How did you start working with Loki? Are you able to tell us that? What was your first interaction when you realized that he could actually communicate with you?
So this is a really interesting story, and I think it's important for people to hear because I hear a lot of people who are very surprised when they hear that people are having religious experiences that aren't Christian in nature. I was just talking to someone about this yesterday, and she was very puzzled by the idea that my experience with Loki could be similar to her experience with Jesus. But for me, I was raised Christian. I was a very devout Christian for a while because I am very sensitive to spiritual energies. So for a while, I was with this church and I was really all about what they were doing. But there came a day where I realized there were groups of people that they weren't really interested in helping, and that there were people who were very unhappy with how things were going, and they were not interested in listening to those people. So I ended up leaving Christianity entirely after doing some looking around at what different churches were doing. And then I started having religious experiences with entities from a number of different pantheons, which was very interesting for me because I had been raised with this Christian theology, this very like, oh, we know what's going on, and if our theology is true, then this other theology can't be true. And that was blown out of the water for me very quickly because I started to hear very vividly from a number of beings that were not acknowledged by Christianity and were also not all from the same religion. And I think that the effect of that was for me to be like, you know what? I'm not going to worry about the theology. I'm not going to worry about the logic. I'm going to worry about these beings that are speaking to me and that are saying and doing helpful things in the world, but just not people I expected to encounter. And Loki was one of those. And he was the one that I ended up working with on the most sustained basis. Some of the others, it was like they just dropped in to say hi, but but Loki and I got along.
When you did you meet Loki when you started interacting with the pagans, or was it even before when you met him? Did you know who he was?
This was before, actually. And for me it was very much a thing where growing up in this very conservative Christian church, I was not even allowed to know what a pagan was.
Mhm.
I was told, pagans are bad, don't read their books, don't even pick up their books, they're dangerous. And I was always kind of like, okay. But then I get into my 20s and I find out, oh, this is what pagans do, this is what I've been doing all my life. So it was a very validating kind of homecoming to. I remember when I walked into my first pagan shop and there were runes on the wall. And runes were something that J.R.R. Tolkien used, who was a Catholic author. So we were encouraged to read his work. He had had runes in his books, and for some reason I felt really drawn to them, and I learned to write with them, and I found them very therapeutic. And I didn't know that they were actually part of Norse religion at the time. The same tradition that Loki is part of, the runes are part of. So it was this very like, wow, I'm home, because I was with this group of people who were having these similar experiences to me that I hadn't even known that was a thing. And Loki's also, he's a clever boy, and some people see this as shady, but I see it as Trickster sometimes. It's interesting because if you look at Trickster mythos, they get in trouble for telling the truth at least as much as they get in trouble for making misleading statements. And one thing that a lot of people report with Loki is that they thought he was someone else at first. And a lot of the time it's because they were in Christian situations where they were like, oh, we're not allowed to talk to pagan gods. So if anyone comes up to us and is like, hey, I'm a pagan god, they're just going to shut that person off. And that actually did happen with me. I had a calling from a goddess before I met or knew about Loki. And it was a very clear goddess calling when I was still very Christian. And I was like, I talked to people and I was like, well, there's nothing I can do with this except ignore it because, good Christian girls don't work with goddesses. And I still kind of regret that because that was the most powerful religious experience I've had in my life still to date.
Mm.
And part of me is like, what would I have done with that lost decade? If I had embraced that calling when I got it, instead of saying, no, this isn't something Christians do, and not responding to her for a decade. But when Loki came in, he was like, oh, I'm a fictional character, so it's fine to talk to me. And I was like, okay. And a lot of people do report that, you know, he got to be with them and got to be this very helpful, supportive figure in their life before they knew who he was. So that's very interesting and very in keeping with the trickster energy.
This is WZRD Chicago 88.3 FM, and we have with us on wizard Catherine Carr, who is talking about her new book, Breaking Your Bonds. When you met Loki, when Loki appeared to you, was he making a statement, foretelling something in your future, or was he giving you some advice when the first time that he came into your life?
So the first time that I really properly met Loki, um, I'm a writer. This is useful to know. I'm a writer, and I'm one of those writers who really likes to psychoanalyze characters. So I, as far as I was concerned, was working with a fictional character, which is just a hobby of mine that I really enjoy. And then something changed. And the best way I can describe it is I got stuck inside his mind and I was like, whoa, you're way bigger than I thought you were, and you're not one of mine, are you? Which, if you're a certain kind of fiction writer, maybe you'll understand, but I've had this happen a couple of times where I've been working with a fictional character and then something has changed and I've been like, wait a minute, you're not one of mine. You're real and you are very large. And that is how I met Loki. We were just kind of hanging out and sparring, really. He likes to do that. And that was before we got into any kind of situation where he was giving me guidance. Now, one of my other hints was there was this very interesting moment where I saw a vision of runestones in my mind's eye. And at the time, I didn't know those were a thing. They are rocks that have runes carved into them. And I was like, that would be a great thing to have. I'll have to make some of these when I get back from this convention I'm going to. And then I got to the convention and there was a vendor selling them. And I was like, this is a thing? This is a thing that people do? And it's used for divination? Okay, I guess we're doing this. And there was a witch in my room who had switched in because someone else in the party got sick and she taught me how to use them. So a lot of serendipity, but that was also one of my early clues that like something more is going on here.
When Loki is sparring with you, is it a little bit of like what is related as Socratic teaching? Does he enlighten you as you spar along?
That's a good comparison, actually. For those in the audience, Socratic teaching method is when the teacher asks questions and doesn't necessarily supply answers. And it's this famous, there's that famous quote from Socrates that the oracle says, I am the wisest of all Greeks, and it's because I'm the only one who realizes that I don't know anything. And Socrates, that was very much his teaching approach. People thought he was so wise, but it wasn't because he was going around saying, this is how it is. It was because he was going around asking, how does this work? What does this mean? Are you sure? And people were learning so much from the process of examining their own experiences and answering his questions that they were like, whoa, this is the smartest guy ever. But he wasn't, a preacher. He was someone who asked questions, and that is a good description of some of my experiences with Loki.
Mm. And are you able to give us a little bit of some examples of those aspiring sessions with Loki?
Unfortunately, I'm not. They're a little bit hard to describe, but
Okay.
if anybody is looking for some enlightenment, I do recommend the Socratic method of discussion.
Mhm. When so when does Loki usually appear on the scene? When you're in distress, or uh, when do you does he appear when you need him, or when you maybe don't need him, maybe you actually do? How could you tell?
Yeah, he is famously a little bit unpredictable, which is not surprising for his character. I do find that he does tend to be there for people when they really need him, and that's something I really appreciate because there are a lot of Loki people I know who actually did not have that experience with the Christian God when they were growing up, and we can speculate about why that might be, but who do get it with Loki. And I have been just so grateful to him because I work in ministry and I do healing rituals for people, and there have been a lot of times where I was working with someone who was in very acute distress and he did show up for them and did things for them that I couldn't, and I'm just so grateful for that because we live in a world that can be pretty hard and people can have a lot of existential crises. And my experience has been that he is someone who tends to show up for those, and sometimes in weird, unexpected ways. but sometimes that's what you need, is to be a little surprised.
So could you describe what Loki looks like to you? And is that the same appearance for other people? Does Loki look the same to others as he does to you?
Yeah, so Loki is a shapeshifter. So him looking different to different people is kind of comes with the territory. But a lot of people see him as a very tall redhead, very skinny. He gets portrayed as almost elfin a lot. There's an artist, Casey Trier, who I think really captures a lot of the way that a lot of Loki people see him. But different people do see him differently. Some people do see him as the Marvel Loki, the kind of belief among the community is that that's definitely not the Norse myths. Marvel made a lot of changes to his personality and the stories and all of that, but that he doesn't really mind the Tom Hiddleston portrayal. So he does look like Tom Hiddleston to some people.
What about the court jester? Sometimes when you talk about what Loki does and making jokes about something that is actually very real, that sounds a bit like the court jester. Is there any connection between the two?
That's another excellent question. In the oldest manuscripts, the oldest Icelandic manuscripts that we have, there actually are portrayals of Loki where he looks very much like a court jester. And you can find those on Google. And one of the things that I think people often don't realize about court jesters is that they're in the popular imagination as these very silly characters, and they can be that, and Loki can be that. We have a great affection for the silly side of him. But the thing about the court jester is that they actually had a very important job because they were, in a certain capacity, the only one who was allowed to criticize or question the king without getting executed because they could do this whole oh, I was joking, it's my job to be ridiculous. But they actually did play an important role because very often, if you had a king who was not in a good mood and none of the nobles who were below him in the power structure wanted to point out, hey, you're making a terrible decision, the court jester would do it. And they could get away with it because of that reputation for silliness.
It's almost like a roasting.
Exactly, exactly. Actually, there's a poem called the Locusena that is just Loki and the other gods roasting each other, and it's glorious.
Mhm. And where could our listeners find that?
That is by Snorri Sturluson. I don't remember off the top of my head what my favorite translation is because it has been translated from Icelandic a few different times, but it's the Locusena, and it's one of the most gloriously irreverent religious texts I've ever read. And my favorite thing about it, if you do go read it, is listen to the accusations that they don't deny, because there's a bunch of things where he's like, well, you did this, and they're like, let's change the subject. So that's all just a really amusing read to me.
Mhm. And so at the end of your book, what is your conclusion? How can people be helped by uh, reading and uh, contemplating breaking your bonds?
So the book itself, one thing I do want to emphasize is that I do open and close with trickster gods. As it happens, when I was finishing up the manuscript, I had a visit from a trickster god from another pantheon who you will hear about, who was helping people with this work of, not following orders, but following your own divine calling instead. And but in the book, I also go through some exercises to help people learn and practice things like consent and boundaries and discuss the concept of personal autonomy and what it means to make your own choices and not, the choices that other people make for you. So I think the book is, I've been told that the book is very useful in that respect, in that it helps people work into the concepts of consent and boundaries, which are things we talk about a lot, but often not so in depth. I've had people tell me, gosh, I had no idea that there was so much to those concepts, and the exercises really helped me. So that is another big portion of the book. And the idea is that you get to understand how to pay attention to your own internal voice, and then you take action. There's also a description of the ritual that I use to get that going on the metaphysical plane. I also, at my website, catherinecarr.org, I have a sign up for a mailing list, and that will get you a free ebook version of Breaking Your Bonds. And I also hold or not weekly, excuse me, monthly free rituals around the new moon. So if you sign up for the mailing list, you will be notified of those. And those are Zoom based because Loki has people all over the world, and there are people all over the world who can benefit from this work. So
You mentioned boundaries, and there's extensive discussions about boundaries. In what way does Loki define boundaries? He appears when when he's needed, let's say, and then but in what way does he respect your boundaries?
So one of the most powerful teaching moments that I've ever had with Loki was, you know, we very often do not grow up with people encouraging us to protect our boundaries, even at their expense. It's becoming more common in some progressive cultural circles, but the first time I really had someone encourage me to defend myself even against them was actually Loki. And there was this moment where I was in a really bad place because I don't even remember exactly what triggered it, but there had been someone who I thought things were going really well with, and they got very angry with me for doing something that was, I thought, a fairly reasonable thing to do. And Loki shows up, and I'm like, well, how do I know I can even trust you? Because I keep having this thing happen where I think that I can trust someone, and then they act very hurtful toward me. And he just kind of stared at me and took a knife off his belt and handed it to me. And that's kind of the metaphysical knife I use for the breaking of bonds look. But it was so great because it didn't even say anything, but it was just the very strong vibe was, well, if I ever hurt you, just stab me. And I'm like, no one has ever given me permission to like defend myself before. And that really taught me a lot, I think, about, not to get sentimental, but about what love means, because it was the first time I'd really had someone say, even if it hurts me, I want you to protect yourself. And so that was a very powerful moment.
Mhm. Do you have a copy of your book nearby? Could you explain the cover?
I do not have a physical copy, but if you go on Amazon or on catherinecarr.org, having issues with the book printers, but that's a whole other thing. You can see the cover, and it just does show chains being broken. And in the ritual that we discuss in the book, it is what's called a cord cutting ritual, where you physically break or destroy some kind of ribbon or rope as a symbol and a metaphysical manifestation of the bond that you are choosing to break. And it is a very powerful ritual, I should warn you. I really started doing this work more publicly because the first time I facilitated it for a small group of people, 6 months later, I think like half of the people were living in different states, in different careers, in different romantic relationships. So the ritual will get things going, and it can be a lot, but sometimes that's what you need.
Catherine Carr, thank you so much for joining us on WZRD Chicago 88.3 FM today. And good luck with your book. Are you doing any book readings or anything in the near future that our listeners would should know about?
I am having some issues with the book printers, so I don't have any book signings set up yet.
Mm.
But I am going to continue to host more virtual events that you can learn about if you sign up at catherinecarr.org for my mailing list. And there will be book signings coming to at least Chicago and Michigan in the next 6 months. So
Okay. Thank you so much, Catherine Carr. Good luck with your book and with breaking your bonds.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome.